Welcome everyone to this pre-recorded conversation that we're having ahead of the course, Biocivilisations, with Dr. Predrag Slijepcevic. Biocivilizations is an upcoming course starting 6 November. It will be a 6-week course, and it is titled Biocivilizations, Becoming Citizens of the Biological Multiverse. And in this course, Dr. Slijepcevic will be presenting a novel approach to reconnecting to the natural world based on his book, Biocivilizations, A New Look at the Science of Life. And essentially, this course will be a 6-week journey into the idea that we as humans are young, ecologically connected species, and that we have much to learn from that which has existed for billions of years before. And so, in this conversation, we will be diving into a few of the topics and themes and the ideas and questions around this course and around this book. And this will be, I think, kind of a winded conversation. For those of you who haven't listened to Advaya Conversations before, our approach is kind of just opening up a can of worms and looking into more questions and often not finding the answers, but finding that the inquiry is more, I guess, relevant and appropriate for our times than trying to find the answer. So that's kind of the approach that I'm entering into this conversation. Before I start into my whole spiel of questions, Predrag, I wondered if you wanted to, introduce yourself, your background, and how you found yourself writing a book about biocivilizations and how you ended up initiating a course, I guess, about this as well.
Right. I've been doing sort of biological science, various projects and research into molecular biology and genetics for maybe about 2-3 decades. I'm educated as a veterinarian, but then my PhD was about genetics and cell biology. And over the period of 2-3 decades working on various projects, things develop into different directions and sort of new avenues of thought open. But I always wanted to know more about nature rather than science can tell us. And at the same time, I studied philosophy. So by combining these two approaches, science and philosophy, you get a different picture than the only scientific picture. And from that sort of avenue, science combined with philosophy, but also with reading poetry, because many poets are philosophical as well. So combining all these three, you get a completely different sense of what nature is. I can see that as a scientist. I know I teach students and I know what I can tell my students about science and biology. There are things that I cannot tell them as a scientist. I can only tell wider things that include philosophy and poetry to an audience that's willing to listen. That's open, actually, that has an open mind for this. And I guess this Advaya course is aimed at that kind of audience, people who are not restricted to just one side of thing, either science or philosophy only or poetry only. And the term biocivilizations also reflects that, because civilization traditionally is only a human thing. We think, we humans think we are the only producers of civilizations. We are only civilized species. But once you include into that picture philosophy and poetry, etc., you realize basically that civilization is actually a biocivilization, that everything started with bacteria 4 billion years ago. And we are the latest sort of civilized species in a long, long history of biocivilizations. So that's in brief what I meant by this book and why I've written it and why I want to do this course.
Thank you for that introduction. I was smiling a lot because I think this is such a beautiful continuation of the themes that we've explored. And I think also for a lot of people who might be new to the course and new to your work and new to Bio in general, I think they might find it strange to weave together lines of inquiry between like, science and poetry. And for them, it might seem like they've never been able to enter into a conversation about science or biology because they only know how to appreciate poetry or the other way around. And the beauty of this course and your work is that you come from a background that weaves together these two really beautiful things. And I think at their heart, explore a very similar approach to the world, right? Which is at the heart of it, like a love for life and a love for the earth. And whether that's expressed through like poems or science, they're both kind of coming from the same heart. And I'm sure we'll expand a lot into that during this conversation. But it's really nice to know your background. And you introduced a little bit about the term biocivilizations. I would love for you to kind of tell me a little bit more about whose work that builds upon and kind of what conversations you're entering into, what ideas you've studied that kind of led you to the term biocivilizations. Yeah.
I mean, the term is mine. It's a new one. I mean, I sort of surfed the internet and I found only one term, biocivilization, which was a name of a meeting that took place a few years ago. But the actual term biocivilization is new, is a new one, and it reflects what I said earlier. In terms of people who I sort of followed or whose work I used to base this concept, I mean, there are a few of them. I think I would say that the most influential one is a lady called Lynn Margulis. She's basically one of the authors, co-author of this concept, Gaia, together with James Lovelock. But Lynn Margulis was a highly original biologist who has proven the theory of endosymbiosis, and she worked against the tide of scientific opinion. In 1967, when she tried to publish her seminal paper about endosymbiosis, 15 scientific journals rejected the paper. But she was persistent, and eventually this was published in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, and the rest is history. Now we recognize basically endosymbiosis as part of the science of life. Without endosymbiosis, there wouldn't be the story of Gaia. So Lynn Margulis is probably one of the most influential biologists of the 20th century. I would say even, one of the most influential biologists after Darwin and Lamarck. The other people I followed is Gregory Bateson. He's a biologist by education, but he was involved in the development of cybernetics. He was the only biologist involved in that development that took place maybe around after the Second World War. And he developed the idea of the natural mind. His famous book, The Mind and Nature, A Necessary Unity. Many scientists would probably challenge his view of the natural mind, but in the book I try to follow proper science to test his idea of the natural mind, and I think there are ways to do it scientifically. The other people I would like to mention, the currently living scientist James Shapiro, who's a molecular biologist, and he likes bacteria. He thinks that bacteria are in many ways more intelligent than humans in controlling, say, the planetary, biosphere. Another person is Stuart Kauffman, who thinks of nature as the ceaseless creativity. So this opens the avenue for us scientists actually to think of nature as a creative system, and any creative system is not mechanistic science. It must involve, creative attitude that's more appropriate to, say, poetry rather than science. And of course, I have to mention Franz Kafka, a writer that I introduced the book with and then finished the book with his story of a report to an academy. Franz Kafka is a genius writer, but he has written some things that you can really, that he didn't intend to be, for those, say, short stories to be used in the present context, but we can use them basically in his story about an ape that was forced to sort of change into a human being mentally. He presents that in a report to an academy, and then through that we see the dangers of believing too much the dogmatic side of science. So in the book, I think I challenge that sort of dogmatism of science, but this is not to say that science is inappropriate. No, science is a perfectly legitimate way of understanding the world, but it has its limits.
I love that. And I just want to say that I think it's super interesting. I guess the reason why I asked you about like the people who your work builds upon is because in this very like anthropocentric world that we live in, we have this tendency to kind of believe that any of the work that we create is kind of solely owned by us. And I feel like the best kind of scientists and the best authors, the people and the thinkers that we work with also at the Gaia and the platform at the Gaia are people who acknowledge that we have original work and we have original ideas, but like all of these function as a collaborative, and we kind of produce the best work when we put together the work of our predecessors, and then producing something original like the Biocivilisations, which builds upon so many beautiful past strands of science and poetry, as you have mentioned. And I guess we can kind of go really deeply into the talking about science a little bit. I wanted to start by bringing up this quote that I found really interesting. You opened your book with the fact that Biocivilizations is an acknowledgement of the mystery of life and its deep uncertainty. And you also write that the bravery here is an act of breaking long-held dogmas that you also mentioned just now as you were talking about the people who draw inspiration from. And I wanted to say that typical scientists, as I mentioned as well, don't usually approach life this way, and they don't usually say that like life is mysterious and that life is uncertain, and it's kind of almost taboo to say that like things are uncertain, that you can't measure them, that there's a mystery. This kind of approach is, I would say, quite novel. And so the kind of scientists who are approaching science in this way is novel and is really exciting, especially with the ones that we've worked with, like Dr. Patricia Cation and Dr. Andreas Weber, who we will be talking with as well. And they probably would disagree and also find that the best scientists are the ones that are willing to interrogate dominant paradigms like mechanistic science and question where those came from and how we can do better. And so I was wondering what your thoughts on those were, and kind of specifically about the idea of approaching science and approaching biology with the idea of kind of going into it with a mystery and going into it with uncertainty. Like what were you intending by saying that? And perhaps what kind of backlash did you also face in approaching science this way?
Yes, I think that's that's a good question. Well, what I meant by mystery, I think there are two sides of that mystery. Let me start with the one that's much closer to every single human living. And again, science has its own way of dealing with things. But that's not the only way of knowing. And again, I have to incorporate poetry here. And I have to perhaps use the words of one famous writer, you can call him a poet as well, Vladimir Nabokov. He was one of the most controversial 20th century writers, but a very clever one. He was unique in a sense that he was not only an artist, a writer, he was also a scientist. He studied zoology and he was basically studying butterflies. And he was an expert on butterflies, and he proposed a hypothesis, a theory, that during his life working at the Harvard Museum of Natural History, that no one cared about. But when it was about the migration of one butterfly species and how it came from Asia, say, to America. And after he died, molecular biologists actually proven that he was right. So he was well ahead of molecular biology, decades. So he had a kind of shamanic knowledge that was actually above science. So when I say mystery, I like to read two sentences, basically, that Vladimir Nabokov started his autobiography called Speak Memory with. So I'll just read these two sentences. The cradle rocks above an abyss, and common sense tells us that our existence is but a brief crack of light between two eternities of darkness. Although the two are identical twins, man, as a rule, views the prenatal abyss with more calm than the one he's heading for at some 4,500 heartbeats an hour. End of quote. So the mystery here basically is that all of us, every single human being, will die. So that the mystery of death, we don't know that. I mean, the science cannot tell us much about it. And to go back to Nabokov, he was known as chronophobiac. Chronophobiac means someone who was against the concept of time. So we really don't know what will happen when we die. So that's one side of mystery, which is deeply humane, and science cannot tell us about it. But we can use, words or, poems of Nabokov, or, what the other philosophers have written about that. So that's one side of understanding mystery. The other one is more scientific. What I really meant by mystery in the book is that we cannot predict life. And I'm not talking about the human scale of time. Human scale of time is 70, 80 years. That's how, the average human life. But the time scale of life is millions or billions of years. And nature, say Gaia, who's basically an entity that produces life, Gaia really cannot predict its next product. It's completely unpredictable. So Gaia, in a sense, is more of an artist rather than a scientist. If I can use this analogy, I know that many scientists will dispute that, but a scientist who is close to that side of things is Stuart Kauffman, who says that nature is the ceaseless creativity. So something we can't predict, really. So that's what I meant by mystery. But I really don't, those scientists, two people you quoted, I agree with them, because when we stayed within the realm of science, we have to use the rules of science and try to answer questions using those rules. But we also must also keep in mind that science has its limits.
Yeah, and actually, I hope you don't mind me moving around the questions a little bit.
No problem. Yeah.
going based on what you brought up. I guess moving into to talk about science and how it needs to shift and adjust in the face of biocivilizations, and if we, as a world, as a scientific community, take the concept of biocivilization very seriously, that means, and as you suggest in the book as well, that science as a whole and science doing as a process needs to shift and needs to change. And it's not, of course, as you said, that we abandon science, because there's so much utility and so much beauty that comes out, and actual important things come out of science, as we all know. So it's not about abandoning science, but it's about adjusting it according to the insights that we have about Gaia and about the living planet. And so, I want to quote something that you wrote. You said that the Anthropocene, after all, can never replace Gaia as the dominant ecological force on Earth. And you say that modern science is entirely based on mechanistic cybernetic models and largely ignorant of autopoiesis, and that we have to give those models a chance. So what does it mean to shift the scientific models in the direction of recognizing Earth as a dominant force? What does it mean to take seriously that humans are like our cybernetic models have like their limits, and how do we kind of, as you say, like move beyond the limits that science has put itself in, the boxes that it's kind of put itself in? And I guess you could share a bit more about the ideas that you explored in the book as well.
Okay, so I'm a scientist, basically. So everything that I have written in the book is based on science. But some things are, of course, not based on mainstream science. And the challenge to the cybernetic models of nature, I can quote a theoretical biologist and mathematician, Robert Rosen, who has written quite a lot about, anti-mechanistic attitude of biology. He has written few books, many research papers, and he used mathematics really to prove that organisms are different from machines. So machine, something that we humans produce, and say cells or plants or animals or us are completely different, fundamentally different products, and life and mechanics are different categories of logic. So this is to some extent contrary to the mechanistic attitude of science. If you look at the structure of science, I explored that in one of the chapters of the book. Science is entirely based on physics. Physics is the fundamental science, and physics has a tendency to mechanize everything. And Robert Rosen was saying we can't mechanize life. And according to him, the primary science for us should be biology, not physics. And actually, he had support from some physicists in that attitude. A physicist called Walter Elsasser has written a book about that shift, how we can shift science in order to understand ourselves and life better than physics can tell us. And actually, the physics itself is split into a sort of mechanistic and quantum. Quantum is a still mystery for physicists. I mean, Roger Penrose, a famous physicist who received a Nobel Prize a few years ago, he says, whatever life is, whatever consciousness is not based on computation. So he's a physicist, actually, who thinks similarly to Rosen. So we have to, the purpose of science is to challenge itself. Science must not stay dogmatic. If it stays dogmatic, it becomes an ideology. So we have to challenge it. We have to, so in the book I says that, I think we have to really accept this notion of Robert Rosen that life cannot be understood through mechanistic science. And I have a colleague called Sergio Rubin. He's a cyberneticist, a scientist who follows Rosen, who follows this Gaia theory. And with his colleagues, he published a paper 2 years ago in which he compared how basically cybernetic models will work. It was a theoretical paper, as opposed to these autopoietic models. And the conclusion of this paper is that if we think we can control nature, control Gaia through cybernetic models, we are actually wrong. So, and he has proven in the paper that Gaia is a biological system, that it has its own rules called autopoietic rules. And if we try to impose the human way of thinking on it, it won't work. So as simple as that. So, and in the book I say, okay, we can still continue with our mechanistic science, but we have to have an alternative option. And that alternative option is autopoietic Gaian science. We have to have something that, in the case our mechanistic model do not work, we simply use these, these autopoietic models to try to resolve existential problems that we are already facing. And those problems will become more acute in decades to come.
And this is off the script, but I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit more about maybe a concrete example of like an autopoietic model. I mean, I guess, and a good example would be climate change, right? Like talking about approaching climate change with a mechanistic scientific approach versus approaching it with one that has the considerations of how Gaia works in mind. And so, could you talk a little bit more about what your, I guess, ideal approach would be like, that's not like cybernetic, that's not, based on human engineering?
Just to give you a concrete example, it comes from my colleague Sergio Rubin. He toyed with the idea, I mean, they produced a theoretical scientific model, and one scientific idea as to how to tackle global warming is to release huge amount of a gas into the atmosphere that could sort of cool it down. To produce albedo. Albedo is an effect of cooling the planet. So, if you rely on cybernetic models, cybernetic models tell you, yes, that could work. We simply pump a gas into the atmosphere that would reflect, reduce, CO2, etc. And eventually we would reduce the temperature by 1 degree, 2 degrees, any desired temperature. But then Sergio Rubin and his colleagues actually produced a model to test that, whether that would work. But of course, they used the autopoietic nature of Gaia, and they used proper science, chemistry, etc., to input into their models. And their autopoietic model says, yes, we can do that, but then Gaia will simply eliminate all those things and do their own way to deal with that. And Gaia's way and human way are not the same. So essentially, the message of this model is that if we try to do that, to sort of engineer the atmosphere, we could exacerbate the global warming or climate change, and we could do more harm than good. So, and for that reason, I think we need to have alternative ways. We don't know how Gaia would respond, and it will definitely respond because it's a global system, a system that's much older. I think the first form of Gaia emerged probably 3 billion years ago. And it was based entirely on bacteria. and bacteria produced oxygen, etc., and everything produced the system in which humans can live, other animals can live, plants can live. And that system has its own mind. And our basically task as scientists is to probe as to how we can understand that mind. Whether we can understand fully, probably not, but at least we can understand it to an extent to help us survive the existential challenges we created.
Yeah, it's amazing because what I'm hearing is that, you know, the advice, or, you know, that feels almost still anthropocentric, but it's, you know, listening to and observing through science, like how the earth works, tells us a very simple truth, which is that instead of trying to engineer our way out of this crisis and out of these problems, the solution is to listen and to observe and to try and work with, rather than, you know, try to impose our own solutions on it. Because the earth in itself, with all of its ecosystems and all of its agential parts, have very intricate and detailed ways of working that have been developing for billions of years before we even existed. And you brought in a great segue for the next question, which is about bacteria. And I would love to talk a little bit about that, because I find the story so fascinating. You detail it so beautifully in your book, which again, highly recommend everyone go check out. You will also get through the Chelsea Green publishing team a 50% off the hard copy, as well as the audiobook on the course. So a plug for the book there. But in the book, you talk really beautifully about the story of bacteria and how it was essentially the first civilization, how it kind of spontaneously developed cross-kingdom communication, which then exploded a bunch of types of relationships that include like mutualism and parasitism, predation and competition. So from kind of bacteria, I kind of want to say that it made everything else come alive. And I'm wondering what this, you know, maybe you can tell us a bit more about the story, because I'm obviously summarizing it in a very coarse way. I would love for you to explain it in your words, and tell us a bit about the kind of implications of this story, if, you know, we take seriously that bacteria, coming back to the idea that bacteria is the most intelligent and that bacteria will outlive us all, that you write in your book as well. What are the implications of this idea? And if we follow it to the end of the line, you know, what would we really do? Yeah. So.
Yes. Again, I'll answer this question as a scientist, basically. And I'll start with quoting James Shapiro. He's a professor of microbiology at Chicago University and a great expert on bacteria. In one of his papers, he says that in many respects, bacteria are more intelligent than humans. What he means by, and I agree with that entirely, what he means by that is that essentially bacteria are founders of Gaia, founders of entire life on the planet. Life started with bacteria roughly 4 billion years ago. But Gaia as a planetary system, it took about 1 billion years for bacteria to build this planetary system, and the first form of Gaia probably emerged about 3 billion years ago in the form of bacteriosphere, meaning that the planet is entirely inhabited by bacteria. And bacteria produced a system that essentially enabled the life of all other organisms. So the only way we can do productively as scientists, life scientists, even physicists, is to learn from the primordial system, the system that started life. It's not an easy task task for us because science led us into a different direction. And that direction is perhaps, generated by the European culture maybe 400 years ago at the time of Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And the product, and this was a great development in Europe, but the final product of that was that the human species in the extreme form is the most intelligent species in the history of life. And the Enlightenment tells us that everything starts with humans. Everything should be judged by human standards. But what Shapiro and bacteriology is telling us, that's wrong. We can't start from, the product that appeared 4 billion years after the initiation of life. That's just one of the most recent product. But what matters is this product that started life, and these are bacteria. So in the book, I spent quite a lot of time trying to help readers understand, say, that how we see the world, eyes. Eyes are basically a bacterial product. The first form of eye was a bacterial eye, how bacteria respond to light. And this is proven now by science. So our sense of vision is basically rooted in the so-called bacterial eye. Everything else, how we sense the world, comes from bacteria. How we hear the world, again, comes from bacteria. So, and this is a huge gap, huge abyss that we need to cover. Whether that's possible, whether scientists will accept that, I don't know. But there are colleagues that, like James Shapiro, and I have 3 colleagues that we are now writing a book together, all scientists. We try to basically tell everyone, scientific community, to prove that, all living beings are sentient and conscious. And sentience and consciousness started with the first living beings, with bacteria. So, so the humans have a different form of consciousness and sentience, but we inherited everything from bacteria. So it's what I'm trying to say is that we have a huge task of sort of trying to learn or to cover this abyss that the Enlightenment, which was a good product at, in Europe 400 years ago, but things moved on. And we have to challenge some of those conclusions. And I hope the book can help in that regard.
Yeah, and definitely you spend quite a bit of time illuminating it. And as someone who has heard the story in very brief iterations before from previous thinkers that we've interacted with, lots of people in this space that we talk to are really interested in bacteria, and so I've heard this story, but it's the first time I've read it in such detail. And so I appreciate you putting a lot of that very complex science that probably most people will never get into and never be able to understand because it's so coded in a lot of scientific language, but putting it into a book form and putting it into a story form makes it so much easier to understand the story of the primordial civilization. And it's really interesting to go so far back into history, history of science, and going into that. So anyway, I could nerd out about that story for a long time, but we have limited time, so I'm moving into the next question. I would love to touch on the chapter on engineering, and in which you talk about how bacteria and fungi and plants and animals don't have the human capacity to produce engineering blueprints, which is quite obvious to everyone because they don't have engineering blueprints like we do. But that the lack of analytical planning skills actually frees non-human species from forming autopoietic relationships with their environments, and that the relationships they form with local environments are instead autopoietic. And you kind of say that they sense kind of different cues in which that help them to kind of orient themselves to the world in an autopoietic way. And you then conclude to say that in the case of modern humans, the blueprint is in our heads, oriented to the world by the instrumental essence of technology. And so I found that super fascinating because it points to this very simple idea that if we don't have kind of our human brain switched on in the way that like kind of plants and animals and fungi, they don't have the human brain. Instead, they rely on the cues from the environment, and so they engineer based on the environment. But we have kind of a different aim and goal, right? And then we engineer in ecologically destructive ways. And so there's a lot to learn from plants and animals. And I would love for you to kind of expand a little bit more about that. Maybe give us a few examples or one or two examples about engineering that is not human, and how that could kind of inform a different approach of how we build our civilization. Just a very crude way of saying it, but how we build our civilization in ways that might be ecologically restorative and regenerative instead of the current way that we're on right now.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most challenging parts of science: how to engineer the human way, how to engineer so that this is a productive thing, that this is not a destructive thing. I mean, to some extent, we humans and our technologies, we have to basically do some destruction, to kill some species. That's the nature of life. But where our modern technologies brought us to is that we essentially making harm to ourselves, and we sort of risk being completely self-destructive. So how to move from this self-destructive into a more productive way of engineering nature? I think that's a big challenge for us. Whether we can achieve it, I don't know. I would like to hope that we can. And I think that the only way for us to do that is to understand really the way nature engineers things and how things work in nature are, collaborative way. Just to give you an example, and I talk about that in the book, an example of ants. Ants are species that are very close to humans in social terms. There is something in biology known as eusociality. This is the highest form of sociality in nature. And the eusocial species are ants, termites, honeybees, and humans. So, and eusocial species tend to expand all over the planet and then engineer things for themselves. An example I want to use are so-called leaf cutter ants that live in South and Central America. They actually take leaves from trees and do agriculture. They cut leaves, feed this leaf biomass to fungi, and fungi then produce food for them. So that's the ant agriculture. In order to accommodate that agriculture, they built huge underground constructions. I call them ant cities. Say a typical ant city, the underground one in South America, would be about 8 meters wide and 4 meters deep. That's huge because ants are 1,000,000 times smaller than us. And in this, kind of city, they do agriculture and consume quite a lot of biomass, leaves, etc. And if there are no natural forces to stop them destroying all the biomass, they would do that. They would simply go on and destroy the Amazon forest. But the nature is organized in a way that all these species are ecologically intertwined. So in forests, there are predators who eat ants, and through eating, these are not only other insects, but also birds, some plants, etc. And through those relationship, an ecological balance is formed. And in that balance, then ants become central parts. They simply have to sort of follow these rules. They can't rebel against those because there are predators who would eat them. They would stop them from acting as maniacs. And that's fine. That works beautifully and worked for 50 million years. So ants actually conquered the planet, and they sort of worked in the ecological balance. But we humans learned that if these ants are sort of imported from, say, South America to North America, this happened by chance. These ants have been moved through human transport from South America to North America, and they basically established their colonies there. No natural predators for these ants there, and they really become maniacs. They actually destroy everything. They destroy gardens, industrial agriculture. Humans try to stop them, use insecticides, chemicals, nothing works. So essentially, this is telling us that nature has its own way that is still impenetrable to us to understand. And for us, the only way to sort of produce long-term models that can keep us live in harmony with nature is to really try to learn. There is no other way. If we pursue our own aims only, following our sort of mechanized technologies, we will end up as these ants that moved from, controlled area into uncontrolled area, become maniacs, and then self-destruct. So, many scientists now saying that the humanity is on the way of self-destruction. And the job of science is how to prevent that. And science has to be open to other non-mechanical models. And one of those is, just to try to learn from those species that lived in harmony for 15 million years, like ants. We humans, on the other hand, exist only for about 300,000 years. So we are very inexperienced ecologically. So I think we have to use this as a strong argument for us to force ourselves to the path of learning, because we lack that experience that many other species have, simply because Gaia tested their capacities because they live for millions of years. But for us, actually, to pass that test of Gaia, we need to live as a species maybe a million years. Whether we can, we don't know.
That opened up, the last bit there really opened up a lot of questions for me in my head, which I'm not going to expand upon because I think that's what the course is for. But some of them was definitely to really think about, to really sit with the idea of the fact that humans are, I think a lot of us like to say that like we humans are a blip in the history of the world. And to really sit with the idea is truly life-changing, to think about how our entire society has to shift and the way that we move through the world has to change if we really recognize that we as humans are the least tested in kind of the grand scheme of all the species that exists in the world. As you said, like all these other species that we are looking at, even the smaller ones that we can't see, like ants, they've been around for much longer than we have. And so then really the ask of us is to really turn to, as you said, other species, and think about what we can learn from them, think about learning from the repeated tests they've been going through on this planet, and how we can also kind of humble ourselves in that in that way, and to prepare ourselves for, I guess, that kind of test, and to not assume that we have, just because we have all the language to our science and all the results that that we like to base the strength of our civilization on, those things are kind of small in comparison to the science that the Earth has been doing for far longer than we have. I mean, that's just kind of a level of ramble in response to the thoughts that you shared, but I really appreciate kind of opening those lines of inquiry, and I hope that people are drawn to it and would like to, think more about it on the course with us, as we'll certainly do. And I'm aware that on the course we will be doing kind of lecture-based sessions, and then after that opening up with problems and discussions. And I'm really excited to see what kind of fruitful discussions and rigorous questions come out of that, in kind of the spirit of real science, right?
Can I just interrupt you here and say that what you call real science is something more modern. I think science in the modern form is probably not older than 300 years, and the Enlightenment, Newton, Galileo, Darwin, etc. So that's what we mean by science. But actually science exists in nature. I mean, all species practice science. I'll explore that in the course. But just looking at us humans, there is a form of science called native science. So native science is something that's practiced by traditional societies. And modern science started acknowledging that only very recently, because there are ecological problems that professional ecologists cannot resolve, but they see the traditional societies, because simply they understand nature better in more detail, have solutions for this. So they started inviting representatives of these native societies to scientific meetings to share their views with them. So a typical traditional ecological knowledge, this native science, views nature completely differently. Just to give you an example, there was a book published in 2018, published by the leading science publisher, Cambridge University Press. They invited these traditional, there was a professor, professor of ecology somewhere in America, who comes from the background of Native American Indians, belongs to one tribe of those, but she's a professor there at one of the American universities, and she took the lead, and together with their colleagues and traditional knowledge, they've written this book. And there is a beautiful part of that book in which they say traditional philosophy of ecology recognizes plants as different people. Can you imagine that? I mean, plants as different people that we can learn from. And then they applied science and combined, compare the modern industrialized agriculture with the agriculture from traditional knowledge. And they compare the ecological impact. And using scientific methods, they concluded that traditional ecological knowledge is actually ecologically friendly, whereas modern agriculture is destructive. I mean, Vandana Shiva, who has written the introduction to my book, she's one of those clever people who argues against the attitude of industrialized agriculture that is so destructive. So I just wanted to say that apart from this science we call science, modern one, native societies had their own science that was ecologically friendly.
Yeah, and I was frantically trying to search I think I can't remember his name now, but he is an indigenous author who I remember being in conversation with Gavin Van Horn from Center for Humans and Nature. We were talking about or I might have been reading one of his essays talking about oh, what is his name? I will write it down in the description of this video when it's posted. But this indigenous author essentially talks about that whole concept of plants as people, and how that is a kind of indigenous idea that has been around for so long, and that real mainstream science is only finally beginning to accept
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
explore the idea.
Yeah, and I mean, my colleagues, I have 3 colleagues that I collaborate with, and we're trying to write a new book. One of those, I mean, I'll give you their names. František Baluška, he's a botanist, professor of botany at the University of Bonn in Germany. The other one is Arthur Reber. He's a cognitive psychologist from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And the third one is a physician, William Miller Jr., who's a physician and independent scientist. And myself, we're trying to write a new book in which we are going to argue that plants, bacteria, every single form of life is conscious. So saying that plants are different people is actually scientifically correct if we want to put metaphors and poetry into science. So there's nothing wrong with that. And maybe mainstream science is wrong if it does not recognize that possibility.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm gonna leave that kind of there for people to explore some more. This conversation will of course be captioned, and I'll add all the resources that we've been talking about in that transcript. And I'm also conscious of the time, so I wanted to kind of move to the very last question. Just a little bit of a long one, but we've also kind of talked about it a little bit. But I would love to kind of end on this note. I'm really personally fascinated by the idea of the Gaian mind. And I recognize that it's still a contentious concept for a lot of scientists in the mainstream space, in the mainstream academic space, to recognize the Gaian mind. I would love for you to explain a little bit about what that actually means for people who have never come across the idea of the Gaian mind before, and talk a little bit about how, as you in your book demonstrate that that there is proof that the Gaia as a system, as a mind, is real, and that that the Gaian mind can be compared, as you say, at the very least, to human ingenuity. And that struck me as a very, I guess, contentious quote, like not to me personally, but I think to mainstream scientists and to people who have never considered this idea. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about how you feel about the Gaian mind, and whether you kind of have the same fascination with it as I do. And yeah, I would just love to pick your brain about it to kind of close this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the mind of nature or mind of Gaia comes from Gregory Bateson, as I said. And he had 6 criteria for testing the natural mind. And those criteria are basically all scientifically testable. So it would be difficult for me now to go into details of those criteria. But a simple thing to understand is that a system that exists for 3 billion years cannot be stupid. It must have its own mind. In other words, whenever that system is faced with the existential challenges, it has its own ingenuity to overcome them. Greater ingenuity than the human ingenuity. Let me give you an example. We're all familiar with dinosaurs. We're fascinated with dinosaurs, those species that died 66 million years ago. the current scientific understanding of disappearance of dinosaurs is that the asteroid hit the planet somewhere in the area of today's Mexico, a huge one, and this, released huge amount of energy that sort of killed many, many species, including dinosaurs, but the system survived. Gaia survived. And just to give you the extent of that catastrophe, we humans, the most destructive things we produced are nuclear weapons. So today there are, several countries that have those. United States and Russia are the, superpowers. They each have about 6,000, nuclear warheads, etc. So when you put all the nuclear weapons that we humans have and explode them, we think that will destroy life. And maybe that's right to some extent. But the scientists calculated that this asteroid hit produced the amount of energy that's 1 billion times greater than the energy of all human nuclear weapons. And what happened? Nothing. Gaia survived. It was just a blip. Gaia swallowed that huge, nuclear bomb, billion times greater than our bombs, and continued living after that. Life thrived after dinosaurs died. And in many sort of episodes of past, Gaia was exposed to existential challenges greater than this over the period of 3 billion years and overcome them all. And I would say because it has its own mind. And, this is, I can't persuade my colleague scientists that nature has mind, but the only thing I can do is to basically say, read Gregory Bateson, and if you want to read my book, so perhaps that would clarify things.
And so on that note, I would love to close this wonderful conversation. It's been almost an hour. I really have a lot more thoughts, I guess, than when I first came in with all these questions. And I'm really excited to explore these more over the course and in discussion with other participants. And to those people who are listening right now, who are considering taking the course, please, I hope this conversation kind of enlightened or opened kind of the topics for exploration for you. And hope that kind of you feel inspired to come on this shared inquiry with us and Predrag, led by him and his book. And so kind of pointing everyone back to the course, which is on advaya.life and will be linked in the description of this video. And I hope that people feel called to participate and called to read this book and share kind of the wisdom that's been shared with us through the book. And Predrag, thank you so much for this really interesting conversation. Interesting is a terrible word to describe it, but at the moment, that's all I've got. But it was really a conversation that opened up a lot of new thoughts for me. And I was wondering if you had any kind of final words to people who are prospective students of this course, who are considering taking this course, and what would you have any final words to say to them before we close?
Yes, I think we can learn. The only way to learn is to learn together. I mean, I'm not saying I know everything or I'm right, but we can learn together. You can challenge me, in the course, and we can perhaps correct some of my misunderstandings or your misunderstandings, because learning is a sort of exercise that's communal. And to quote a great American, now I can't remember his name, I will probably remember later. He was a famous professor. He was, he had many PhD students who later on got Nobel Prizes for physics. I think his name was John Archibald Wheeler, and he said universities or any places of education exists for professors to get educated, not only for students but for professors. And he was prompted to think that way because he learned of the term black hole. We all know what black holes are. And he's an expert on black holes, but he learned about black holes not from his colleague scientists, but from a student. So essentially, education is two-way, three-way, multi-way, exercise, and it's only communal. And say, humanity as a collective must learn those techniques in order to survive.